Hey guys, just continuing the discussion with Theoretical BS, and Sam Harris's new book just came in today. That's the one I mentioned in the other video. But this is just going to be another defensive video where I explain my position and address objections. I'm already looking forward to the next video where I get to do a bit of offense and critique his position for a change. But as for now, let's see what objections he has.
You can't derive an ought from the is of Christianity any more than you can from the is of atheism.
This is known as the is-ought gap. Now, I've made a video on this once before, but my views have changed since then. I believe I used to be making the same mistake that you're making now. Changing my mind was largely due to a discussion I had with a YouTuber named Wilthiswork, with one L. And he's made a video rebuttal to both me and Theoretical BS, and they're both really good. You guys should subscribe to him. He's only got 3 subscribers as of right now, so you could be one of the first. But anyways, back to the is-ought gap. The is-ought gap was first presented by a philosopher named David Hume, and it's a very important concept to know in moral philosophy, but it can be a bit tricky to understand. What it basically says is that you cannot derive an ought from an is, or you cannot tell people what they ought to do based solely upon what is the case. Another way of saying it would be that you cannot get prescription from a mere description. Now I know that's a bit confusing, but this concept makes a lot more sense once we start using some examples, I hope. Alright, now a lot of people may say something like, rape causes suffering, therefore we shouldn't rape. And at a glance that sounds good, but the conclusion, we shouldn't rape people, does not follow solely from the idea that rape causes suffering. There's a hidden premise in there, and that hidden premise is, we should not cause suffering. The is-ought gap tells us that you cannot derive an ought from an is, and nothing about that is statement implies that either of those ought statements are true. This applies to preferences too. The fact that I want good grades does not imply that I should act on those desires, any more than saying Ted Bundy wants to rape people implies that he should act on those desires. Clearly, what we do value does not determine what we should value. Now all this means is that we cannot derive oughts from preferences, social norms, empathy, selfish interest, evolution, or any other naturalistic explanation, because those are all ises. And yet oughts exist, so how do we account for them? In the words of Charles Darwin, I fully subscribe to the judgment of those writers who maintain that of all the differences between man and the lower animals, the moral sense or conscience is by far the most important. It is summed up in that short but imperious word, ought. So now that we have oughts, our moral philosophy has to be able to account for them, and I believe mine does. I would solve the is-ought gap in the same way philosopher Michael Hume would. If, as I believe, some moral principles are self-evident, then there is no need to derive ethics from biology, physics, or any other descriptive facts. This is how my theory solves the is-ought problem. We recognize that oughts, or moral obligations, exist, and that implies that a standard of morality also exists, and I argue that God's nature must be that standard of goodness. Next, we were debating about the biblical story of Elisha. For a quick summary of that, Elisha is a prophet, and he was mocked by a mob of youths, and he called to God, and 2 bears came and attacked the mob. Now, I argued that the youths were between the age of 12 and 30, while he argues this.
First of all, the word ne'er, which means boy, child, kid, youth, whatever, is only half of the Hebrew term used in this verse. It's paired with the qualifier katan, which means little or small. Other verses in the Bible that use the word ne'er to describe young men do not have the qualifier katan attached to them. So yeah, the literal translation here is little boys.
Actually, we find the phrase katan ne'er in 1 Kings 3:7 referring to Solomon, and Solomon is commonly thought to be at least 20 years old at this time. As I said in the first video, that verse can refer to people between the age of 12 and 30. If it was referring to preteens or something, do you really think they'd be allowed to walk around in the woods unsupervised like that? I mean, there are bears out there. That'd just be dangerous.
Secondly, nothing about this account remotely implies that these children are acting in a way that was physically threatening to Elisha. The children are standing behind him, not in front of him, intercepting him, and they're telling him to go on up, Baldy, or in some translations, get out of here, Baldy. Now, if your intention was to hurt somebody, would you be telling them to go away from you? No.
So you contend that Elisha was not in danger because a mob of over 40 people insulted him and told him to leave. But to me, those seem like 2 obvious signs of danger, and I think a man named Jay Phillips would agree with me here.
Jay Phillips says as a young black man, he has to watch his back. And on Friday, his reasons why became obvious. He says a truck filled with 5 white men drove by him and started yelling unprovoked.
F you, nigger, get the hell out of our white town, get the F out of our white town.
So they insulted him, told him to leave, and here's what happened next. That video makes me so mad. By the way, Jay got up and got a couple more shots in, and then the three racist guys ran away, and later they were arrested and charged with assault. But anyway, I wasn't expecting this to be a real point of contention. I mean, anytime a mob begins insulting people, it's dangerous, and this is due to a phenomenon known as groupthink. So if you ever find yourself in a scenario where you're being insulted by a mob of people, I would sincerely hope that you'd recognize the danger and get out of harm's way. So next, you weigh in on a conversation I was having in the comment section.
If, as you say, any argument about God's intention is a fallacy, then it would be fallacious for you to claim that God's intentions are ever actually good.
Now wait a minute, I did not say that any argument about God's intentions is a fallacy. All I did was explain what an argument from ignorance was, and you and I both agree that that's a type of fallacy. To summarize it, if you do not know God's intentions, and morality is composed of actions and intentions, then you're not in a position to call God immoral. Now, unlike the person I was having that discussion with in the comment section, you attempt to determine what God's intentions are, and so do I. Now, I don't need to look at God's actions and attempt to just guess what his intentions are. He explicitly tells us what those intentions are. He loves mankind and desires that none of us should perish, and is willing to act in a way to achieve those ends. So without reason to doubt that, I have no rational grounds to conclude that God is immoral. But I also have an extra-biblical argument to determine God's intentions. The Christian God is said to be perfect. Perfection entails lacking nothing. From those two, we can see that God has no needs to fulfill. Therefore, God creates not to fulfill one of his own needs, but creates for the future benefit of the creatures. And you also bring up this point.
A world in which objective values exists is indistinguishable from a world in which they don't exist. This is why the idea of objective morality is trivial and meaningless, and incoherent.
I don't think you can accurately say that a world without objective morality would be identical to this one. But I'll grant that for now, because I don't think your argument makes sense even in principle. Consider this analogy, for example. It is possible that we are just a body in the matrix, or a mind in a vat. And while it's technically possible that that's true, and that the external world is just an illusion, it doesn't make it rational to believe that actually is the case. Pointing out the matrix would look identical to this world doesn't make it rational to believe in the matrix, or to disbelieve in reality. Using the same line of reasoning, even if your argument is true, it doesn't support the conclusion that the idea of objective morality is incoherent. Now you talk about Nazis.
I gave you an example of somebody who did not recognize the value of all human life. Now your counter-argument that Hitler did not see Jews as human is equally problematic.
I don't think that's problematic. I mean, morality can be broken into three relevant categories: reason, intuition, and emotion. Reason tells us things like kicking someone in the face causes them pain. Intuition tells us that causing people pain can often be wrong. And emotion gives us things like empathy, shame, and guilt. Basically, it gives us incentives to act in a way that we think is moral. Now, I argue for objective morality on the basis of intuitions, and believing that Jews are subhuman is not a refutation of our intuitions. It's just an example of an error in reasoning. And errors in reasoning are usually due to either cultural misinformation or cognitive biases. An example of cultural misinformation would be somebody telling you that Jews are subhuman and you believing them. Where cognitive biases, that would be like, take egotism and stereotyping, for example. We have a tendency to think that we're awesome and people like us are also awesome. And if you combine that with stereotyping, you can be led to believe that people who are different than you are genetically inferior. Believing that Jews are less human than you is nothing more than a factual error. But that factual error can lead you to behave immorally. Now, you referenced David Hume earlier, so I think it'd be apt for me to reference him here. He says, ethical disagreements generally stem from misunderstandings about the actual circumstances surrounding a given act, or from incomplete analysis of the consequences accruing from that act. Let's see what else you have to say.
I mean, I can give you an example right now of a person who unequivocally denies recognizing objective value in anything.
Later, you reveal this person that you're talking about is you. Now, I understand what you're saying, but what you're saying contradicts my common sense, modern science, and even some of the things you said earlier in your video. You even seem to undermine the idea that you don't have a moral sense by saying this.
Not only does this person recognize no objective values, they freely admit that even if objective values existed, they wouldn't know how to possibly distinguish between those and the values they merely hold subjectively.
It surprises me when people deny that they have knowledge that some things ought to be valued. I mean, you're essentially denying that you have a conscience. Way back in ancient Greece, Socrates talked about the inner daemon, not a demon, but an internal voice that told him even when he was giving an awesome speech, if he was being dishonest, that he shouldn't have done it. Ancient Chinese people called it Ren, which is the inner ability to tell right from wrong. Adam Smith called it the internal witness. The Akan people of Africa called it Taboa, which is a recognition of and compulsion to do what is morally right. I've been calling it a moral sense, but other people call it a conscience, like Charles Darwin. Now, while it's possible that all these people around the world have it and you do not, it just seems improbable. Especially considering that you admit that you wouldn't recognize it if you had it, and especially because you say things like this.
It is objectively true that rape causes unnecessary suffering.
For the rapist, the suffering of the victim is necessary to achieve his instant gratification. But you're making the claim that it is objectively true that rape causes unnecessary suffering. That means objective morality exists. As it is worded, your claim is either false or it proves my position. As it stands, the statement is inconsistent with your view. You would have to revise it to say something like, rape causes unnecessary suffering, unless you deem it necessary. And if that's what you meant by that statement, then it seems completely meaningless and not even worth mentioning. Next, you attempt to argue that my innate knowledge of moral truth is not true if you lack that knowledge.
If you respond that you just know, then I'll ask you to account for the fact that other human beings just know mutually exclusive propositions about the objectivity of certain values, like myself, and then I'll ask which of you is right.
You don't hold a view that's mutually exclusive to me. You claimed very clearly that you do not recognize any objective values, and if you don't recognize anything, it's impossible to recognize something different from me. Even if I grant your argument, it doesn't disprove my position. It just makes you the equivalent of a morally blind person. Now obviously, blind people wouldn't disprove the validity of your sight experience, so why should a morally blind person disprove the validity of my moral experience? It turns out a philosopher named Michael Hume has a very similar point. He came up with the concept known as the idiot's veto. And to summarize this, he just says that the failure of some people to perceive a fact does not destroy the possibility that other people perceive it.
Because you knew that honesty was morally right before you knew that God was honest.
Not quite. We know that whatever deity is the standard of morality has an essential property of honesty. That then becomes our litmus test for further arguments about which deity it is that exists. And as you know, I believe that the Christian God best fits the bill.
If what you're saying is true, the biblical God is not the standard of morality at all. No deity is. The true standard of morality is this specific set of qualities.
A specific set of objectively moral qualities cannot just exist abstractly like that. I even think you argued that earlier in your video. But I'll present several arguments in the future explaining why that type of explanation is incoherent in my upcoming video on moral Platonism.
Even if it were the case that no deity existed which embodied these qualities, you would still have knowledge that these qualities are morally right and their negations are morally wrong. In fact, you claim that this knowledge is self-evident.
Right, but if God does not exist, then philosopher of biology Michael Ruse has it right when he says in reference to morality. But I do claim, considered as a rationally justifiable set of claims about an objective something, it, meaning ethics, is illusory. Without morality being founded on God's nature, our moral knowledge, which seems so self-evident, must be an illusion.
So do you need God in order to know that honesty is morally right?
No, not at all. Anyone can recognize that. God is not needed to explain how he came to recognize objective morality, but he is necessary to explain how an objective standard of morality can actually exist. You don't have to believe in God to recognize morality, just like you don't have to believe in fingers to see fingerprints. However, we should realize that our ability to see fingerprints requires that fingers also exist. We should realize then that the existence of right and wrong requires that an objective standard of morality exists. You're essentially arguing that our ability to see God-sized fingerprints is not evidence of God's hand at work. As always, test everything, hold on to the good.